Introduce our next video speaker. He has a very short message for us. We have a message from Larry Johnson. Larry Johnson's a veteran of the CIA and the State Department's Office of Counterterrorism. He is the founder and managing partner of Berg Associates, which was established in 1998. Larry provided training to the U.S. military special operations community for 24 years. Let's hear from Larry now.
Good evening. I'm Larry Johnson, and I regret that I'm not able to attend with you tonight. Prefer to stay in Florida where it's warm instead of the frosty streets of New York. I've lived long enough now that we're seeing a time come that the real question of whether the CIA should continue to exist is on the table. Not just the CIA, but the FBI. And it boils down to the abuse of these organizations to involve themselves directly in politics domestically in a way that's so blatant, so obvious, and so twisted. Regardless of what you think about Donald Trump, the standard that has been applied against Trump by the intelligence community in directly collaborating with British intelligence to interfere in our own election is, I think, unquestioned and without precedent. I know for a fact that John Brennan was recruiting people within the agency to join what they called the Trump Task Force. Normally, intelligence task force are set up to bring together both the analytical and the operations side of the house. To focus on a particular issue, bring all the talent to bear. That was done in this case to a U.S. presidential candidate. And the point is, you may not like Donald Trump, but if they can do it to Donald Trump, they can do it to anyone. And Trump may have been the flavor of this time, but we have to look ahead, and there may be some other populist candidate rise up without Trump's flaws that the American people would want to support. And what we've established is a precedence where the intelligence community can actively interfere. The other reason, I think, to disband the CIA and start over is the influence, the corruption of intermingling the Directorate of Operations with the Directorate of Intelligence, or as they used to be called. The problem there is that, analysts are oftentimes pressured to try to support covert actions that are underway, and any attempt to do objective analysis will be squashed or shunted aside. I witnessed this, experienced it firsthand as an analyst on the Honduras account during the wars in Central America, where Honduras was operating as an aircraft carrier for the Contras. I saw firsthand how our analysis was questioned and challenged when we made an honest assessment about what was going on the ground. And yet it was undermining, or so we were told, what the operations side was trying to do. I've also been told by one of my good friends, a former chief of station, that one of the reasons they wanted to keep, that he thought the analysts should be kept separate, is because the operations side knew as well that they didn't want the analysts to become enamored with sources and in that way lose their objectivity. I think it is critical for any country to have an objective, independent intelligence agency that can collect information and provide independent analysis to government. Sadly, we no longer have that. And because we no longer have that, I think the very freedoms and constitutional rights that we claim to uphold in this country are at grave risk, and something must be done to correct it. And I think one of the things that should be done is the elimination of the CIA in its current form. They need to start over. Thank you.
Excellent. We're going to hear now another short video from Ava K. Bartlett. Ava Bartlett is a Canadian independent journalist and activist, and she's actually going to be sharing with us a bit more about her recent trip to Ukraine. So we can hear now from Ava.
Eva Queen Bartlett. Since 2007, I've reported from occupied Palestine, Syria, Venezuela, and the Donbass, notably the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, formerly in eastern Ukraine. I've just returned from my 7th trip there. I first went in September 2019, 5 years after the coup in Ukraine and 5 years after Ukraine started its genocidal war against the people of the Donbass. Since 2014, Ukraine has relentlessly shelled the Donbass republics. In January and February of this year, before Russia started its military operation, Ukraine's shelling intensified dramatically. I returned to the DPR and LPR in March with a Russian Ministry of Defense delegation which included 2 mainstream French channels. We were told at length about the suffering of the people of the Donbass. We were shown the site of a March 14th Tuchka-U strike which killed 21 civilians. We visited various sites recently liberated from Ukrainian forces. We heard how Ukrainian forces occupied and mined a hospital in Volnovakha, and we met with representatives who detailed the horrific crimes the Ukrainian forces committed against Donbass people. These mainstream French channels excluded virtually everything we saw and heard. I returned to the Donbass in April and May, staying for 3 weeks, and going to Mariupol, which is still being liberated from Azov Nazis, also going to areas in the LPR which had been recently liberated. In June, I returned for another 3 weeks, and have done so every month since. Every time I've been there, Ukraine has committed heinous war crimes, including targeting busy markets and streets and parks, targeting a maternity hospital. Thankfully, due to the intensity of the shelling that day, staff and the patients had already been evacuated to the basement. This was not mentioned in legacy media. Ukraine has been intensely shelling the very center of the city, where there are no military targets whatsoever. In August, Ukrainian shelling right outside the hotel I was then staying in killed a woman on the sidewalk, and shelling one street over killed an 11-year-old ballerina, her grandmother, and her ballet teacher, tearing them to pieces. In late July, Ukraine fired rockets, each containing over 300 PFM-1 mines, known as petal or butterfly mines, due to their design and how they flutter to the ground, and generally don't explode until someone steps on or otherwise touches them. Ukraine fired most of them at the end of July, but even today, Donetsk civilians continued to be maimed by them, like this 14-year-old boy, Nikita, who used to breakdance and do mixed martial arts. As of now, 87 civilians have been maimed by these mines, including 4 children and many elderly. Ukraine's use of them is against international law and is against the Ottawa Treaty, which Ukraine itself signed, pledging to destroy its stockpile of mines. Further Ukrainian crimes I've documented while being there are Ukraine's attacks on medics and other emergency rescue services, their vehicles, and their centers. Ukraine has also heavily targeted water infrastructure. When I returned in April, water was being rationed, so you only had access to running water a few hours a day. In subsequent months, there was no water, period. You had to go to collection points where emergency services provided water and fill up buckets and 5-liter jugs if you wanted to be able to wash. Legacy media will never report on any of these Ukrainian war crimes, and I've only detailed the ones that I've had personal experience with. In some cases, media have had the audacity to report on a Ukrainian crime in the Donbass as a Russian crime in Ukraine, using media from the Donbass to back their lies. Legacy media have employed the same dirty, unscrupulous tactics as they did in the reporting on Syria, Iraq, and a host of many countries before, completely fabricating events that never occurred, erasing the voices of people whose suffering doesn't fit the NATO narrative, and attacking and smearing those of us who counter and expose their lies and propaganda. Canada's CBC had the audacity not only to smear me and wage a character assassination on me, but in doing so, they drew from the Miratvorets, which is Ukraine's kill list, entry on me. CBC gave extremists who might not have known my name a new target. CBC and all the other legacy media pushing disgusting war propaganda would never allow myself or other journalists to speak uncensored, which is all the more reason to support Covert Action. It's a platform that is well respected and that gives voice to those of us who report from on the ground, thereby giving a platform to the very voices, the very people who are being targeted by NATO.
An important report from Ava. We're so glad she was able to send something in to us. We have a few more video words from longtime, decades-long Cuba solidarity activist Gloria La Riva. Gloria is part of the Cuba and Venezuela Solidarity Committee, as well as the Atue Project. She's been a presidential candidate for the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and she wants to talk to you today about what's going on in Cuba and why it's so important to pay attention to not only what's happening in Cuba, but of course the U.S. blockade and the impact it has had. So we're going to hear from Gloria next. Oh, and she had COVID,
Friends,
which is
I'm
why
sorry
she couldn't
I can't
be here.
in New York at the People's Forum with you on this wonderful but necessary occasion. My name is Gloria La Riva. I live in San Francisco, where many activists have been especially busy during these almost 3 years of pandemic to make visible Cuba's struggle against the U.S. blockade. Taking cruel and cynical advantage of the COVID pandemic, the Trump administration signed 243 measures against Cuba, designed to finally do the country in the same way that two presidents previously and Congress tried so hard to do in the 1990s, after the demise of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was its biggest trading and political partner. In the 90s, after the Soviet Union's fall, there were two laws by Congress tailored to put the nail in Cuba's coffin, or so they thought. In 1992, the Torricelli Law was written to block Cuba's trade with third country subsidiaries. As a result, in the following year, Cuba's alternate trade with Latin American countries dropped from 900 million to less than 2 million. To less than 2 million. That Torricelli Law that blocks ships from docking in the U.S. if it does business with Cuba or face confiscation is still in force. That was signed by Bush Sr. The next anti-Cuban law, known as Helms-Burton, signed by Clinton in 1996, is even more severe because Cuba had opened up to foreign investment to rescue its economy in its restructuring of the early 90s. Helms-Burton allowed to stop that foreign investment. Helms-Burton allowed corporations and U.S. citizens to sue any entity in the world that invested in Cuban property that used to be owned by U.S. corporations, or even owned by Cubans who later became U.S. citizens. That property is practically all of Cuba. And the worst part of that law that Clinton signed handed power over the blockade to Congress. The prerogative to lift the blockade used to belong solely to the U.S. president, and Clinton handed it over to Congress. How many of you think Congress would agree to lift the blockade? Shame on Clinton. 243 measures were signed by Trump in his 4 years of president against Cuba, and too many to mention. But here are a few of the most damaging. In 2019, the U.S. blocked oil shipments from Venezuela to Cuba by threatening to deny insurance to those ships carrying the cargo. In the midst of the pandemic, when Cuba's tourism and other economic branches were shut down to save lives, Trump blocked remittances from Cubans in the United States to their families in Cuba. That amounted to $1.5 billion the year before the pandemic. And days before he left office in January 2021, Trump declared Cuba to be a state sponsor of terrorism. What an outrage. It's an abomination, because Cuba is the victim of terrorism, not the perpetrator. And by being declared a state sponsor of terrorism, it shuts Cuba off from much of the world in terms of trade, because those countries will be sanctioned even more severely than they are now, banks included. Why do I bring up all these challenges? It's because it is remarkable in these years what Cuba has done in spite of this economic and political war by the United States. First, during the pandemic, only 146 people died in the first year of COVID-19 in Cuba, because the priority was to save lives, even though the economy was shut down. In the second year, unfortunately, more than 8,000 people died. But in the early part of 2021, Cuban scientists and biotechnologists developed 5 lines of Cuban COVID vaccine. 3 of them came into use. And by October 2021, Cuba could calculate because they know their whole population. It's an organized society. They calculated that by November 15, the whole population would be vaccinated, the schools would open up completely with children masked, and tourism would be open for business. November 15. A remarkable achievement. And in 2022, the number of deaths and positive cases of COVID is minuscule. From May to September, one person died of COVID. May to September. While in the U.S., although a country 25 times larger in population than Cuba, over 300 people have died in this last year, every day. It's almost like the government acts like it doesn't exist anymore. We know of that. Another remarkable achievement in Cuba was the passing of the Family's Code, a major update of the original 1976 Family Code. A family code which was inscribed from traditional definition of family, a mother, a father, children. But now, of course, with the passage of time and the social movements that have developed around the world, including in Cuba, the new Family's Code, which was drafted and discussed, debated for almost 3 years, includes the definition of a family to mean that any family that you define yourself, including gay marriage, including single parents, including the right of gay adults to adopt children, something that wasn't permitted before. And the Family's Code includes even paid leave for grandparents who take care of a grandchild that's been born or adopted so that the mother or father can go to work. That's really an amazing concept, that it allows for the woman, the mother or the father, who want to continue working, that the grandparent can be the caregiver and get paid, compensated for it. It also provides for the rights of children, which existed before. But for example, in the broadening of liberating concepts, it says that no longer is the role of a parent parental authority, but parental responsibility to raise their child in love, solidarity, to feed, clothe, and house the child. Anyway, this is compared to what we're facing here, with women criminalized for needing to have an abortion, young adults having no rights, trans rights are being denied, while in Cuba, LGBTQ rights are enshrined in the Family's Code. And another great achievement is their new updated constitution that was ratified in 2019. It's a revolutionary program that it extends to the world. It says they will provide exile to anyone suffering persecution in any country for environmental, political, or economic reasons. So I just wish to say that we need to learn more about Cuba, learn more about what the U.S. is doing to that wonderful island of people, a determined people who are not going to let their society be destroyed, overthrown by the U.S. government, and to extend our solidarity to Cuba. Right now, we're preparing in the Atue project, which we have begun this year, to send a container full of 40,000 pounds of goods, mainly construction materials, plywood, sheet metal roofing, cement, and other things for construction to help rebuild the 19,000 homes that were destroyed in Cuba during the Hurricane Ian in October. It's a long haul, it's a drop in the bucket, but solidarity of people around the world is what will count, and ending the U.S. blockade. So thank you. I hope you have a great afternoon at the People's Forum. Thank you to Chris Agee. Thank you to Covert Action. We need to keep supporting Covert Action. I refer to Covert Action many, many times for my needs of learning about the in-depth analysis and information that the progressive movement needs. Thank you.
Thank you to Gloria. She had COVID, so she couldn't be here, but it's always important to bring Cuba into our spaces whenever we are talking about what needs to be addressed around the world. When we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about empire, we can never forget Cuba. So we have a very short video now from Dan Kovalik. Dan teaches international human rights at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He is also the author of a number of books, including The Plot to Scapegoat Russia. We should have a short little clip here from Dan.
Good evening. First of all, I want to apologize for not being able to be with you in person. I just got back from a month in Russia and the Donbass, and I just couldn't make this trip happen, but I certainly want to give all my support to this event and to Covert Action Magazine, which I think is more important today than it's ever been. First of all, I want to remember Phil Agee, who I got to meet when I was in college. We were protesting CIA recruitment there. We brought Phil to campus to speak, and he made Covert Action Magazine happen, and he was, a key guy in my life for, raising my consciousness about U.S. foreign policy and, really how unjust it is. And Covert Action Magazine continues to highlight the injustices of U.S. foreign policy, of U.S. imperialism. And I would say, in fact, it's unique in that respect. I've just seen so many so-called progressive outlets, such as Democracy Now! Comes to mind, really go off the rails in terms of supporting interventions in places like Libya, really parroting the State Department line on countries like Nicaragua. And Covert Action Magazine, to me, is one of the most principled anti-imperialist outlets in the West, and at a time we need it. As I said, I just got back from Russia and the Donbass, and we see a war there that really is a war between Russia and NATO. Let's face it, we all know that. And Covert Action Magazine knows that, and they write about it, and they're not fooled by the propaganda, as so many people on the so-called left in the U.S. are. And so I go to Covert Action Magazine every day to learn about the nuances of what's happening in the world, and in particular about U.S. warfare abroad. And, I always come away with a new insight and new information. And I hope people support Covert Action Magazine and, read it and learn from it. So have a good evening, and let's keep up the struggle. Thank you.
So we're getting to the close of our program. We have one more speaker here in person with us, and then we have a message from Lou Wolf, who could not be here, but we really do want to hear from Lou. So our next speaker with us is John Parker. John Parker recently traveled to Ukraine in the Donbass region. He was the 2022 Socialist Unity Party and Peace and Freedom Party candidate for the U.S. Senate from California, receiving 105,000 votes in the primary election. And Parker has been a union organizer and public school teacher, and is also a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and the coordinator of the Harriet Tubman Center for Social Justice. Welcome up, John.
Take away from my time. So I just want to recognize Margaret Kimberly from Black Agenda Report, and also Melinda Butterfield from StruggleLaLucha.org. Because, the articles that I have for Covert Action, I also have in those two publications, and they didn't get mad at me or anything and say, because it wasn't about competition, it was about disseminating the information to help build our movement. So thanks to them for that. If you like horror stories, here's one for you. It's the 2022 National Defense Strategy document from the Secretary of Defense, which right out of the gate calls China, Russia, Iran, the DPRK threats to U.S. national security. And this threat must be met by making NATO even more powerful and nuclear capable, especially surrounding Russia. But in terms of priorities, the document, blessed by President Biden, who is quoted in the introduction, targeting China is number one. This will be done, this document states, through the use of provoking altercations in the Indo-Pacific region using Japan, South Korea, Australia, and any other Southeast Asian nations they can recruit to conspire to provoke war from the South China Sea to the East China Sea. Now, yesterday, there was a very serious altercation in the South China Sea between the U.S. and China due to the U.S. war games happening there. And as if that's not enough, this document says the U.S. should begin training and arming Taiwan in asymmetric warfare, which is like guerrilla warfare, against China. So get your tax dollars ready to fund another war costing, this time, hundreds of billions. And unfortunately, we may have to counter an anti-war movement in the U.S. that will probably start blaming China when that country is also forced to respond to the provocations and threats in their security and sovereignty. What we should learn from this document and from the RAND Corporation's published strategy 3 years ago, planning the provocations against Russia today, is that it doesn't matter what Russia does. The imperialists had a plan of action that was determined to cause war by any means, regardless of Russia's actions. While investigating the war in Ukraine, in the Donbass region of Krymskaya in May of this year, I visited a tuberculosis hospital that had been retrofitted for war by the Ukrainian military. They were forced to leave a week or so prior due to the Lugansk People's Militia and the Russian soldiers. But I observed the 122 millimeter shells about this big used by Kiev to make Swiss cheese of the houses just a mile away in Solkiniki. These shells were also used to target the families I interviewed north of there in Rubizny, in a shelter that had housed 350 people escaping the Ukrainian military's assault on their apartment buildings. Although the loud noise I heard often from the continued shelling by the Ukrainian forces was very disturbing, the people in the shelter told me they felt much safer than before, now that the Russian soldiers were protecting them and providing water and food and other essentials for survival. Now, I should mention also that back at that tuberculosis hospital, on the wall next to the missile, the shells, there was a huge swastika about this big. And then there was, right next to it, there was another symbol called the Sonorand. When people say that the Sonorand is the Nazis of World War II appropriated that symbol for their own, and the Azov battalion took on that symbol. Well, so when people say that the Nazi problem in Ukraine is minor, they callously ignore the 10 black people killed at the Top supermarket in Buffalo, New York by an 18-year-old white supremacist wearing the emblem of the Azov battalion. The same Sonorand I saw on the wall in Krymskaya. This youth said he was inspired by New Zealander Brenton Tarrant, who killed 51 Muslims in a mosque. Tarrant wrote in his manifesto that he was in direct communication with the Azov battalion and planning to go there for military training. In fact, Newsweek in 2019 reported an FBI agent who admitted that 17,000 white supremacists have gone through Ukraine to get military training. The Azov Battalion has used the billions of dollars in funding and training from the U.S. since 2014 to build a very successful social media presence, encouraging alienated youth. Playing into the narrative of Russia as invader can only be done when we disappear the over 6 million people in the Donbass region targeted by an openly neo-Nazi-led military. By February 22nd, the bombing of that region increased 20-fold in 7 days to 1,400 bombings per day. Kiev then amassed 150,000 on the border, preparing for a genocidal massacre. And this is why on February 23rd, the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic formally requested Russia's protection. If you really want to know what imperialism really looks like, consider this. According to the United Nations Development Program, the U.S. freezing of Afghanistan's assets is causing the starvation of 1 million children. Think about that. 1 million children because the U.S. is freezing about $9.5 billion in assets of Afghanistan. So Biden, with a snap of his fingers, could stop that today, immediately. He could stop the killing of 1 million children in Afghanistan today, but he won't do it. So that lets you know what imperialism really is and what evil really is. Without challenging the main justifications for this war, we are simply allowing lies to take hold, which will, at worst, garner popular support for U.S. imperialist strategies, and at best, encourage resignation and apathy. Covert Action magazine is an invaluable resource that challenges those primary lies fueling this U.S. proxy war against Russia and China. It's that whole truth that Covert Action is committed to, which will ultimately inspire our working class into action. And any peace movement must be made up of overwhelmingly by our multinational working class and its movements of the people fighting racism and for union rights and tenant rights, for LGBTQ rights and for women's rights, for the rights of self-determination of Haitian, Palestinian, indigenous, black and brown peoples. All these components are necessary in any real peace movement to have any real power, because these are the forces most targeted by U.S. imperialism domestically and internationally. It's these forces that have the most to gain by stopping imperialist war that steals the resources necessary for the survival of their children. And these are the forces whose exploitation the economic beast depends upon for survival. So therefore, they contain real potential power. And I'm going to wrap up here. By supporting this news source dedicated to the truths relevant to the struggles of our class and countering the barrage of misinformation by the Pentagon and its corporate tools, Covert Action magazine continues the proud legacy of Covert Action Quarterly and is indispensable as an indispensable resource that must be supported by our movement and our class. So give generously, as if World War III were right around the corner, because so is the solution if we build it. And really quickly, if you've gotten this flyer, there's a January 13th forum that we're going to be just going into the more depth of this. And it's hard to do because what I just laid out right here is not wanting to be heard in many places. So so it says on here, we're still looking for a venue, but keep your eyes open. And thank you. It's an honor to be here to be a part of this with Covert Action. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that. We are going to hear now from Louis Wolff. Many of you know who Lou Wolff is, but I want to give an introduction nonetheless. Louis Wolff is research director at Covert Action magazine. Lou co-founded Covert Action Information Bulletin in 1978, later renamed Covert Action Quarterly, and now Covert Action magazine with Philip Agee, William Schaap, Ellen Ray, Michael Ratner, William Kunstler, and others. Lou authored many articles and co-edited numerous books, including Dirty Work, The CIA in Western Europe, and Dirty Work 2, The CIA in Africa. We're going to hear some words from Lou, who could not make it, but with absolutely his heart is here with us.
This is a very interesting event for us to do. Because I'm one of the founders of Covert Action magazine way back in 1978. I had gotten to know Philip Agee, and I was present in London at Conway Hall during his first public speech after his first book was published, On the Run, CIA History. And I was sitting up in the top tier of this very large venue, in London, and there, it was standing room only, people to hear Phil Agee. And so when it was over, I walked downstairs and walked up to Phil. There were a lot of people wanting his autograph, wanting to thank him, wanting to speak to him. And I walked up to him. I said, Mr. Agee, we became close right after that. I said, Mr. Agee, how is it possible that you wrote this book exposing the CIA operations that you were part of in Uruguay and in two other countries? How come they haven't killed you? I asked him. And he looked at me very quizzically, and then a smile came across his face, and he said, what I did in that book was to tell the truth, and now the world will know it. And then he said to me, oh, did the CIA send you to me to get close to me? Is that what you're here about? I said, no. I finished reading your book, and I want to help you in any way I possibly can. And we embraced, and we were comrades from that moment on. And I helped working with Phil. I smuggled him back into Germany, where he was persona non grata. I drove him on the Autobahn in Germany all night. It took us all night, and when we got to the destination, he said, "Just let me out of that corner, and please don't look back. Thank you very much, and we'll keep in touch." That was the beginning of my relationship with Phil. All this to say that I am so committed to the work of Covert Action Magazine that, frankly, this is my life's work. I started when I was in my 30s, late 30s, and here I am, 82, and still right there to help and work with Covert Action Magazine. Part of my job today is to find photos that are not copyright photos that we don't have to pay for. And as people will know, photos they speak 1,000 words. And so this is partly what I do with the magazine. I'm very proud to work with Phil Agee's son, Chris Agee. And when I look at Chris Agee, I think I'm speaking with his father, because they're almost like twins. They really are. So this is the work I do. But it goes back to when I was in Laos as a conscientious objector. I refused to join the military, and so I was helping to build a school, building water sealed latrines and deep water wells there. But what did I see around me? Dozens and dozens of people, and not Lao, I'm talking about Americans in rural Laos running around. They had like a uniform, plaid pants, khaki pants and plaid shirts. Can you imagine what the Lao thought of these people running around in their country all around? They used to point them out, but the amazing part of that one is that they knew their names. How in hell did they know their names? That was top secret. And they used to point to them, call them by name. I never understood that. But that showed that the Lao had very good intelligence, and they were fighting their war, their struggle for independence from the French who had colonized Laos. When I arrived in Laos in 1964, there were only 6 doctors in all of Laos. Think about that. And so I later was to find out that Laos was the most bombed country in the history of warfare. Please hear me. And there were the equivalent of 600 bombs every hour dropping on Laos. And that was because the U.S., the CIA particularly, was involved in a war that extended from Vietnam. Laos is immediately to the south of Vietnam, and was also fighting a secret war in support of Pol Pot in Cambodia, which resulted in the massacres, tortures and massacres of about 2 million Cambodians. And we, Covert Action Magazine, documented the fact that the CIA was deeply involved in that one as well. So all this to say that I hope your listeners and viewers will understand why it's incumbent on me to carry on this work together with my comrades in the magazine.
Give it up for Lou. Thank you so much for those words from Lou. So as we come to the end of our program, I want to say thank you all so much for being here, for staying with us, for really being in the space together. It really means so much. Thank you. Give yourselves a round of applause. And I know, especially on the left, we never miss an opportunity to educate. So I hope people walked away learning something, taking something from these conversations. There really is so much. I want to have Sam come up for a final announcement about our pledge cards and about what we really are excited to talk to you about today and really get your support today. So here you go.
Okay, fellow diehards, thank you for coming out. Thank you for staying for so long. Unfortunately, we have some bad news. We have found out that we have not raised more money than the CIA has spent monitoring the live stream. So we just need to raise a few $100 more and we'll be just fine. So don't sneak out. If you're walking out and you see Tiger, raise your hand. If you see Tiger, if you see Mike Locker over here, fill out one of these. If you don't have a credit card, but you have tomorrow's lunch money, throw tomorrow's lunch money to Mike or to Tiger. We really appreciate it. Every penny gets used. We need it. We're not joking here. It's serious. If you're watching the live stream online, give us some of that internet money. I don't know if it's crypto, Bitcoin, whatever. Could click on the whistle. And thanks again, all of y'all, for coming out. I see some old friends in the crowd. Say hello to your old friends. Make some new friends. We're the left we have. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Feel free to mingle. We're going to wait.
So we have another 20 minutes or 25 minutes. Feel free to mingle, network, and also there's a cash bar if you want to go get a drink.